And as we mentioned, if you've got questions, populate the chat with those ideally, and we'll try to address them along the way. Otherwise, we'll get to them toward the end if we've got time. So the overview here is as we begin to actually use TAF data for research and research questions, how do we approach selecting populations as well as defining the measures that we use, both for exposure or outcome or covariate or those kinds of things. The examples that we've been using the data to try to understand here, and I've got a couple of others, but generally are going to revolve around something we talked about yesterday, which is disenrollment and how we look at that, and how we look at the patterns in that and what it does and so on, as well as dual eligibles. So these are not all possible examples, but they run us into a lot of the common issues that I think you'd want to pay attention to in a lot of studies. So first, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about kind of how do you form an analytic sample. How do you derive your sample from a and get it to reflect the population you're trying to reflect. And in this case, we'll look at disenrollment and we'll look at dual status and just outline some of the issues that come up, so that you can look at them. We've also mentioned the Medicaid Data Learning Network a few times. And they, I believe, have a checklist for using the TAF data. That would be another, I think, resource that you could also pay attention to. If we get a chance, I'll put a link in the chat. But if you go to their resources, I believe they have a checklist somewhere on using TAF data that I thought was pretty useful. So this is kind of in that same vein of trying to think about, okay, what are all of the considerations you'd want to pay attention to. So by no means exhaustive, but at least, again, a lot of the things that we see to kind of highlight your attention. So we can get bias in the sample or bias in our estimates and inference if we're looking at ways that we change from our underlying population that's available in the data to our analytic sample. And I want you to consider the idea that if we systematically exclude through data cleaning or other things, some subset of that population, what can happen is, of course, we end up with a population where the characteristics are different. In other words, we're biasing our sample. Our analytic sample becomes a selected sample. And that sample selection is something that we are creating through our choices in data cleaning and those kinds of things. And as I went through yesterday, one of the ways that happens is when we have, let's say, spotty enrollment or less than complete enrollment. Now we know that if we just run a model on, say, a monthly basis, there are going to be people who drop because they're not enrolled that month. So we know that. We also know that if we run it if we try to roll up to some kind of an annual basis, we need to make a decision about what we do with those people who are not continuously enrolled. We may also have other reasons for doing that. So we may want to remove people who are not continuously enrolled because, as I mentioned yesterday, if we consider enrollment in Medicaid as an exposure, then we may think that at least 6 months being enrolled in Medicaid is necessary for the exposure to have any benefit. So we may have a lot of reasons for why this happens, but the effect remains that usually if we're mainly just kind of excluding, which I noted is probably the most common way, we end up with a sample that's different, that looks different, that represents somebody different than the larger Medicaid populations that we may be trying to represent. And in addition, it may result in estimates that are actually different, and that has played out in work that we've done. So it may not massively change your conclusions, or it might, but the point is that it probably will change your estimates to some degree. So that, instead of a population that is a certain percentage characteristic, a certain age, mean age, with a certain level of utilization, you get a population that has different rates of characteristics and different rates of outcomes. That is just kind of naming part of the problem with people who end up dropped for different reasons. So in looking at this, we want to, we've done a little work on disenrollment because it's something that is definitely in the data. It's also kind of a hobby horse for me, but it's definitely in the data, and more importantly, we suspect that it is a problem that is glossed over, and we just wanted to look at kind of what happens if people do or don't take a particular approach to disenrollment. So if we start kind of breaking into this a little bit and say, how would you study disenrollments? How did we study disenrollment? So obviously we're looking at enrollment. So primarily we're not really concerned with the claims and encounter files. We're looking at the DE file. And that I think is fairly straightforward. But then we've got some decision points right away. So at the very least, and this is, as you start making a data request, okay, what year or years are you looking at? Now, as we mentioned in policy differences, and I think about segment 1 yesterday, we had some fairly significant policy changes between 2020 and 2023 in regards to policy about enrollment. In addition, of course, especially the beginning of the pandemic was an incredibly volatile time that we've seen in the data in lots of ways. For Medicaid in particular. And so we decided to, on the one hand, you are losing some information that's more recent. On the other hand, exactly what that information means is not always clear. And I would add that the availability of data doesn't take us all the way through, say, 2023 or beyond yet, right? So we stuck with 2019. And I'm explaining the choices we made so that you can kind of see where the reasoning is. And just think about how the reasoning might apply to your study, especially I think around the pandemic and especially in Medicaid data. So if you're looking at something much more recent, the kind of whole system shock represented by the pandemic is probably something that you'll at least need to consider if you're looking at something in the most recent years of data. So we stuck with 2019 because what we were trying to do is just look at patterns of disenrollment uncomplicated by policy changes by and large. Now, that's not to say that state policy changes and other things may not make enrollment easier or more difficult, but again, just trying to stay away from that big system, the whole system shock of the pandemic and larger Medicaid policy changes. So we also looked at we also need to look at the DQ Atlas for selected years to make sure that we're shoring up any measurement concerns if they exist, or making hard decisions if we can't address them. I don't believe we ran into any problems with the enrollment because enrollment itself is a fairly straightforward measure. Now, if you were looking at things that are happening in the OT file or other things, there may be some other issues. And yes, there are some issues that do come up based on, if you look in the DQ Atlas, based on the completeness of some of the variables we wanted to look at. Sometimes we took the approach, because we're not doing I wouldn't recommend this in a regression model. There's some literature on that. We just used missing categories in some cases when we had missingness. So race and ethnicity information, for instance, is something we wanted to kind of look at, immigration status and a few other things. And there is some missing, definitely in those, sometimes up to I think about 30% in some places. And so when we had missing, again, I wouldn't recommend using a missing category in a regression model for various reasons, but we felt okay because we're mostly doing descriptive work in this case. So then we had this issue of, how do we roll up to a single person? What choices do we have to make? Because we're looking at disenrollment, but we're not looking at a person month, kind of long file level, or a growth curve model or something like that. We're not looking at a longitudinal model. So we're kind of looking at just in some ways, the aggregated effect of disenrollment and what happens when we address disenrollment with a 6 or 12 month criterion. And so, how do you roll that up? Just to give a preview, that deduplication has been a major issue. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the possible selection that we introduced in this in just a second. So what do you do with missing Benny IDs? I believe we ended up dropping those when we had to for the analysis. We didn't always have to because again, this is not a regression based approach where it's where you've got listwise deletion. And then of course eligibility, missing eligibility information. In a lot of cases, we were trying to look at eligibility categories and how they relate to disenrollment. And again, in this case, a descriptive look is one thing, but if you want to think about how the cross-section of missing in some of these variables starts to play out in a regression model where you need, full observation on all of those, that starts to become much more complicated. And so then you need to start thinking about how you're going to address that kind of intersecting missingness. Whereas again, we were doing mostly, at most like bivariate tables. And then we've got beneficiaries enrolled in more than one program at a time. So CHIP and Medicaid in particular, how did we identify those? Do we count them as Medicaid, CHIP? And we did I think we kind of showed in segment maybe 2 yesterday, where looking at the combination of eligibility code categories. So there's several different possible eligibility codes and age categories to kind of get to the categories that we were looking for. So you end up with kind of, CHIP children and other Medicaid children and those kinds of things. But again, those are not the kind of the only way to do things. All right, so we end up looking at a lot of possible things, but if you look across these populations, across years, we were just kind of trying to kind of diagnose what we were looking at generally to begin with in terms of, record numbers and so on. And so we were looking at both, again, staying in the DE record, but using a combination of both MSIS ID and state ID and comparing that to Benny ID, finding that the record counts with a single instance of Benny ID were a lot of help in addressing the possibility of duplication of records to begin with. So we were kind of comparing the use of different approaches to identifying individuals and finding what was the best kind of starting point, with Benny ID being useful there. I think that's mostly what we're going to hear. All right, now this is where I brought up the idea that we ourselves are possibly introducing bias in this look. So in 2019, where we were at least kind of starting, we got MSIS ID and state code there. And looking at we've done deduplication since then, but we had the 100% Medicaid. So in other words, the full sample of Medicaid on the left on the central column there, by age group, and how it breaks down by age group. And then what we did was we decided that because of potential noisiness in the data resulting in some really potentially small amounts of enrollment, these would be people who have less than 30 days in a period enrolled in Medicaid. And we thought that could represent volatility of enrollment systems or other things where there's something going on that we can't quite explain. So for lack of a better word, to kind of clean our starting point, we chose 1 month or more of continuous enrollment as our denominator. So you'd say these are people who have at least 1 month of continuous enrollment to start. Now that does mean that we are dropping some people, and we are slightly changing our sample already. Now this is just in deciding our denominator. This is before we have looked at larger patterns of disenrollment. This is just making sure that everybody's had at least a chance to have some continuous month in there. Well, so that means we're dropping some millions of people over different categories, and the percentages change slightly in the mix of age groups. So obviously you're always, if you're dropping people, you're always losing N, But in addition, the bias to the sample, we kind of did already introduce a little bit to start. And again, there are trade-offs, there's a trade-off there. So we're doing it because we wanted to make sure we had a solidly enrolled sample to begin with, that we would see them enrolled for a month at least sometime during the year, which you wouldn't think is a very stringent criterion, but we did lose people. And so that's just something to keep in mind. That is in the creation of the denominator in studying disenrollment. Another example in moving from, we'll go back to disenrollment in a second, but we're still talking about moving from population to sample and how we identify. So another example of that, or another illustration of that, is among dual enrollees. So among duals, which again, duals are a really interesting group, and we've had a lot of questions about what shows up in the Medicare claims versus and what shows up in Medicare claims, what shows up in Medicaid claims and encounters. What do you see if you've got a dual, given that Medicare should be primary payer for a lot of things. Just a lot of things like that. So we've had a lot of questions about that. But in order to do that, we need to start defining, like, we've got a group of people that we want to study that we call duals. How do you get there? You're given the data. The data aren't, you may get a fairly defined cohort in your data, but usually you've still got some decisions to make even once you've obtained the data. And then to begin with, in requesting your data from the beginning, you need to start setting some parameters. You might want to set them a little wider than the main focus of your study, but you need to start somewhere. So from the get-go, you're making some decisions to define your analytic sample, your cohort. And once you've obtained the data, a lot of times people still do some additional cleaning. So these are some of the decisions we've made. And again, these are judgment calls. They're choices. They have trade-offs. So with duals, we were looking, a number of decision points. So dual enrollment, monthly variables are often useful because they give you some choice as to how you're going to roll things up, as opposed to a latest or some other type of variable. So looking at a monthly variable in this case, what are we, how do we want to roll that up? How do we want to produce our estimates from that? But so we've got, I'll show you in a second, but we've got using member month as a way of producing estimates. And so what we tried to do was really rely heavily on the monthly variable as a way of sticking at beneficiary month as a primary way of looking at this. So we're going to produce things more in terms of beneficiary months, member months, as opposed to beneficiary level, which is a little different than what we looked at in the disenrollment example. So rolling up, they may have one record in the Medicare denominator file. So people had asked some questions in the MBSF, which is the denominator file for Medicare, in the last segment versus TAF. Well, one issue there is that definitely in the Medicare beneficiary summary file, you're going to see like one record per person per year, but you can have multiple records in the TAF-DE, as we've talked about. So what do how do you take that information from the TAF-DE, or how do you combine that information from the TAF-DE with, the kind of single line MBSF, representing the same individual? And depending on what we were doing, we actually had to address it in a couple of different ways, so that there's not one way we did that. We did it in a couple of different ways, but that's one issue. Then you got conflicting information. Sometimes you're going to have different information. I think we might get into this a little bit, but you may have different information in the MBSF and the TAF. Sometimes you'll get examples, and I know that I've seen this elsewhere, but the MBSF may say that somebody's a dual and they don't show up in TAF, or vice versa. Well, those are both from administrative data, so somebody, something's not right there. And I think I've seen some other work comparing, like the Medicare Current Beneficiary Survey might be another way to kind of compare, like what do people think, what do enrollees think about whether they are enrolled or not, and whether that shows up in the TAF, which is even further afield. So there's always some kind of, so in this case though, it's not a survey administrative disagreement. It's an administrative disagreement, because the MBSF comes from Medicare enrollment information in their internal, in CMS's internal repository for Medicare. So this is all from administrative data. It should be, there's input in there from the Social Security Administration, Railroad Retirement Board, and lots of other things. That's all coming from administrative sources. So the disagreement that you might see in there, there's some interest there, and I can't always track the reason for some of those. But if we think about the fact that these are administratively created categories and so on, it's coming from somewhere in there. We got the DQ Atlas to check for any concerns with measures, of course. And again, thinking about what years do we want to look at? Different system shocks like Affordable Care Act expansion may or may not have an impact on some questions. In the case of duals, possibly, So yeah, we just paying attention to years is another consideration. So we got, 5 or so considerations here. And again, the way that we approach these is not necessarily the way that everybody should. So, and here's what I was mentioning. So present in, that is, present in one of these data sources. So these should be duals. And, they don't match up. Now, most of the time, if you look at any given year, the vast majority of people are in both, right? So, somewhere between, mid 80 to 90% are represented in both. Now, this is something that the previous PI of ResDAC, Beth Vernig, always says, which is, you're going to spend 10% of your time getting 90% of the answer. And then you could end up spending 90% of your time getting the last 10%. So teasing out exactly what's going on in these first columns before you get over to the right where you've got both, where these first columns of MBSF only or TAF only, exactly what you want to do with those, and whether you count them, whether you can use them, because, whether you need just the information from TAF and so you're okay with saying TAF only, whether you trust the data systems that feed into those, so that TAF, for instance, if those are data that are, submitted by states, what do you think about the state submission of those data? MBSF with, a few different sources feeding into that, Social Security, Railroad Retirement Board, and so on, exactly what you think of the sources feeding into those, as well as what you're going to do about it. You can spend a lot of time on that. Whereas we do know that a large percentage are present in both. So does that mean that the others are false completely? That we should ignore them fully? Not necessarily. But that's just something to keep in mind, that this is, anytime you start kind of combining some different data sources, you're probably going to get this. And one of the strengths of administrative data is the potential use of them in linkages. So this is something that you'll probably have to deal with, is just at the level of selecting your creating your analytic sample, is what do you do? Not with duplicated records, but non-matches or non-alignment. All right, and I'm not giving you one answer, because there isn't one answer. So again, we had some questions yesterday asking, is there a way to do this? Yeah, there are a few ways to do this. We have a policy not to prescribe things, but some of the ways I suggested are some of the ways that you could approach this. You could exclude. You could have a rule where one trumps the other. Or you'll say, okay, if it's present in TAF, we'll take it, but not if it's on MBSF only, or something like. You can set rules like that, and there are trade-offs to doing that, and as long as you can justify them, they're okay, but there's no one best approach. Again, unless you do some side validation and figure out where some of the non-concordance is coming from. All right, so going back to now we're at the next level of defining measures. So we talked about kind of how do we start using the data to derive an analytic sample or a cohort for our study. We looked at that in a couple of different ways of disenrollment dual. Now we'll look at how do we define exposures and outcomes and that kind of thing. So getting back into disenrollment. So we're taking a very broad look at disenrollment in Medicaid. So to define measures, though, if you want to think about it, disenrollment itself was something that we had to figure out a definition for, but also a lot of other things, because we weren't just interested in disenrollment across the entire group or groups. We wanted to see how does that play out across eligibility groups. So how do you define those eligibility groups? Right? So that's another variable in our study that we need to define. And there's not again one way to do that. There are ways that we've typically done them. There are ways that seem to be readily suggested by the data, but you do have choices. One that I've got a table that I was looking at the other day for is, what do you do with missing or negative age? Now, negative age could relate to, newborns in the Medicaid data. That's different, obviously, than if you're looking in like Medicare. But what do you do with missing ages? Do you fully trust the negative age to represent, to stay within the child, newborn and child population, or do you look at some of those values and decide they're not plausible? Those kinds of things. And lastly, disenrollment. So imagine that you are defining as less than 12 months. So we looked at 6 months and 12 months, but just think of one of the ways that we were measuring this was 12 months of continuous enrollment in the annual file. And again, we were looking at 2019. Well, as I mentioned yesterday, disenrollment and missing data can come on the left censored side. So somebody was newly enrolled during the year. Now, they may have been enrolled previously in a previous year, but for this year, maybe their first month of enrollment was March. Well, they are already enrolled for less than 12 continuous months. Now, this is a problem that we mention in Medicare 101 as well. What do you do with people who become newly enrolled at some point during the year if you are saying that you want all months to be enrolled? What do you do with that? Okay. Or it could be right censored. Somebody leaves enrollment for some reason. Now, you may have death information on that, but you may not. You probably, if you're just looking at the TAF data, you don't really have any information on enrollment elsewhere or what else is going on in their life. And so you kind of need to make a decision. What happens if somebody leaves in October or June, right? Do you make a rule about that you'll keep them in if they make it through at least 9 months? That's one way of doing it. If you make the rule about 6 months, then this is moved from at least 12 months continuous to now at least 6 months continuous, right? So it's already changed the outcome that you said you wanted. So if we start allowing for a little bit less, then this isn't really the study of 12 months continuous. It's a study of fewer months than that. Or maybe you could say, well, we'll allow it only if it's right censoring, but not if it's non-monotonic where people are bouncing in and out with churn. Maybe we set a rule for that. But so again, these are just rules that you set for yourself. They're choices that you make. And then we applied the 12-month continuous enrollment criterion for most of our analyses. We did do an analysis of left and right censoring and so on, and about I want to say at least 30% or more of the lack of 12 months of continuous enrollment comes from left and right censoring. Like a very large, like a pretty sizable percentage of it comes from people who are either newly enrolled or who leave before the end of the year. Not necessarily this kind of frequent churning pattern that you might expect. But we did leave it as the criterion as it has to be 12 full months. That means all the months of the year. Again, that was okay for our analysis. You may want to do things differently if this is important for you in some other way. So there are a lot of different disenrollment patterns, but we you need to make a decision if you're making a rule about, and you kind of do need to make a rule about enrollment and whether you're requiring continuous enrollment and what you're going to do about it. And so, yeah, that's kind of the three buckets that we threw into. So is somebody left censored, they come in new later than January. Is somebody right censored, they leave before the end of the year? Or are there variable other kind of popping in and out patterns? Somebody becomes newly enrolled in March, but then leaves before, so they have both left and right. Or they were enrolled already at the beginning of the year, but they drop out in the middle of the year and come back before the end. Or lots of other ways. So what exactly you're going to do about those? For us, we did keep the 12-month continuous rule because that was kind of the point. But we did do an analysis as well on the other kinds of missing patterns that are there. And then, do you allow enrollment across states? So I believe we captured people with their enrollment across states as long as they were enrolled. But you do need to make a decision about that as well, because it may be for you that you're looking at a set number of states. Well, what happens if they move a state but they stay enrolled somewhere else? Do you still look at their numbers for their outcomes or something like that? So those are decisions that we just have to make. And to kind of fast forward to the end, these are the percents, so they're highlighted in yellow, are the percents that are remaining after removing those who don't have 6 months or 12 months. So another way of saying it is this is the percent that do have at least 6 months or at least 12 months of continuous. These are the people who would stay in. So this isn't the percent lost, this is the percent that stay in after you apply those criteria. With the left yellow highlighted column being the 6-month criterion, and of course you lose more if you apply a 12-month criterion. And you can see, like if you've got 18 and under, you keep about 86%, or if it's 12 months continuous enrollment, you keep 70% of your sample. That goes down to 78% or 79% at 6 months, requiring needing at least 6 months or having at least 6 months continuous enrollment, or down to 54% in that young adult age group. And then also, I've mentioned citizenship a few times. This is one of the analyses that makes me, I think, sensitized to citizenship. Is this one. And U.S. citizens, you got a pretty good rate of retention, relatively speaking. And then as you go down to qualified non-citizens, lawfully present under CHIP, and then there are a few other categories as well that we're not showing here, and the number does keep kind of dropping off. So there is a pretty clear difference if you're looking by citizenship when you're looking at the effect of applying continuous enrollment criteria in terms of who's left. Also, a note, so it doesn't just vary by groups in the data, it also varies by state quite a bit. So these are the states where that rate for the rate of retention after you apply or only include those with 6 months or 12 months. These are the states where it's the lowest. It's not to pick on these states or something like that, but and I would say that these states are not massively far away from many other states in terms of the rates. So again, we're not, this isn't to aim at these states for what they're doing with their Medicaid program. And sometimes having issues with continuous enrollment could reflect a lot of things going on with enrollment in a particular state. So this doesn't necessarily mean that the enrollment in these states is problematic necessarily. So interpreting these, I would be a little cautious. But we've got states where the application of the 6-month criterion would leave only about 72% up to maybe 80%, and the application of the 12-month continuous enrollment would result in having less in your full sample. Less than half your sample in, say, Utah, up to about half your sample, or a little more in Rhode Island or Oklahoma or Wyoming. Nevada. So you've got that kind of a little bit of range around the 25-ish% loss versus a 40 to 50-ish% loss, something like that. And again, how these are percentages. So the percentage is based on the numerator and a denominator. And so how you define your denominator is could make a big difference in the numbers that you see here. So the point of this slide is not to say this is the exact number that is right every time. The point of this is to actually question these numbers and say, what are the choices we made? So for instance, I mentioned how we created our denominator. What are the choices? How does the choice that we made with that particular denominator, how does that compare to if we defined it in a looser or more rigid way? How would that compare if we, with these percentages? Because again, this is a numerator denominator issue. And so exactly how you define, so you can see the difference in 6 months and 12 months in the numerator, but how you define your denominator is going to make a big difference. So just another example of how those decisions can end up playing out in terms of your estimates. And still defining measures, but now going back over to, but now going over to that example from dual enrollees. So one of the biggest things is, duals. How do we define dual status in the beginning and make sure that we're getting a fairly refined definition of this measure? We may have asked, so if we were a researcher making a request, we might ask for a slightly wider population just so that to make sure we don't lose anybody, and then we might have to do this kind of fine tuning when we actually get our data. But as we mentioned, there's a mismatch between Medicare and Medicaid in that dual definition. So what records should you include? So if you've got in the Medicare data, for instance, you might look at fee-for-service claims, and then there's separate encounter data. In the Medicaid, you've got fee-for-service claims and then managed care encounters, right? So you've got claim type codes that can be used to help identify dual. And then you've got what records do you want to exclude? So we may want to, if you're looking at the so what we're going to show you in a second, we're going to be looking at spending and some pieces in terms of the Medicare share of that and so on. So what records should you exclude? So we've got capitated payments, and then there are like service tracking claims and supplemental payments that we wanted to exclude because we wanted to make a clean comparison between Medicaid and Medicare. There are a lot of choices there. These are just some that we listed. So again, this is not us giving you a list saying this is the list of things you should use or exclude. This is showing how we got to the estimates that we're going to show. So this is in this table. Now, one thing, I mentioned this yesterday, but note that along the left-hand column, we actually have different combinations of Medicare and Medicaid, right? So in Medicare, when you've got Medicare, you may have fee-for-service or managed care. And so if you're looking at the combinations there, you got fee-for-service / fee-for-service, managed care, and so on. Well, so the first of those is the Medicare part. So is it fee-for-service or managed care? The second part is the Medicaid. Is Medicaid fee-for-service or managed care? And so we can see that the largest ones are the ones with Medicaid managed care. And the very smallest is the Medicare managed care, but Medicaid fee-for-service, which is understandably a little unique. I wasn't expecting to even find this many people in it all the time. And then note that along the top, we've got full dual and partial dual, right? So we've got full kind of Medicaid benefits and so on versus a partial dual help with copays and so on. So within those, to look at the actual numbers, we've got member months, as we mentioned. This is how we're looking at it. And then what we did was we looked at the different types of service records. So in the table I showed you yesterday, I just used the total service records, which includes both of these added together, but here we're disaggregating them so you can see them. So you got fee-for-service claims per member month, and then you got managed care encounters per member month, and then those are just added together for total service records. That's a gross measure. It's a rough measure, but it's just to kind of get the general rough volume in each of these categories. So then we're looking across these. We can see that the fee-for-service, we've got the most, a lot of claims, and then as we would expect, hardly any encounters per member month. Same thing with fee for service down below in the or the Medicaid fee for service down below. We also don't see a whole lot there. But then if we're looking at those that have a managed care component, we can see that they do result in, more managed care encounters showing up, which again makes sense. It also though shows if you've got fee for service and fee for service, you will have some times where managed care encounters do show up. It's not a lot, but it does show up. And then you have a question of, is that something we need to clean? Does that appear legitimately for some reason? So in other words, the column that says managed care encounters is not fully zero in all the cases that have fee for service for things. So where is that coming from? And so tracking that down, you may be able to find some signals in the data for why that might be, but you're probably not going to get a definitive answer. And then lastly, looking over at this was in the other therapy file, the kind of percent Medicare crossover. And yeah, I think that's all we needed to cover with this one. So we can kind of see, getting to this table, we had to kind of make a lot of decisions about how we define duals, what year we're using, which we don't show it here. I believe it's 2019 also. We kind of had to make a lot of decisions on the way to getting here, and that's just to make a fairly straightforward kind of descriptive bivariate type table. And so that's not to say anything about regressions or other types of modeling. And then just some other examples. So we moved past the use case of disenrollment and duals, and these are just a few more examples of work that we've done. Steph or somebody else, how am I doing on time? Sorry, I had this open.
I think it was supposed to be done at 10:45.
Okay, well, we're almost done. One of the things, so this is from work that I've done on Medicaid expansion enrollees in Minnesota. Now, I would say that much of this work can be done with the TAF files. There are a couple of things, and I'll try to highlight them that are not, you're not able to do them with TAF because of the information, because we obtained the data from Minnesota, but the data structures are the same, and the same decisions had to be made. So here's one example of looking at, this is a comparison of different managed care models or different managed care combinations of managed care plans in the rates of utilization outcomes. This is actually from the paper I think I mentioned yesterday. And there were different ways that we modeled this. So to kind of jump way to the end, we were looking at inpatient admissions, emergency department visits, primary care, and dental visits. And the comparison of one type to the other, and I'm not going to get which was the reference and which was the one we're comparing to. The point is the comparison. Note that the comparison can shift quite a bit depending on the type of model that's used. So our protocol approach, as written into our protocol, was to keep everybody in. And we used, as I mentioned yesterday, one approach to people who drop out due to disenrollment is to use censoring weights. And so we used that in addition to the inverse probability weights we were using for our overall model, and got this set of difference estimates with the confidence intervals. Our biostatistician did not want us to represent p-values in here for a couple of reasons, so that's why you're not seeing a p-value, but you can go by the confidence intervals just fine. So that's the set of estimates we got based on our protocol. In response to a reviewer comment, though, the second set of estimates, they wanted us to restrict our analysis to a 6 months continuous enrollment criterion. Now, you can kind of note that generally your conclusions probably aren't going to change a whole lot. So if you start with the first number of inpatient admissions, yeah, it goes from negative to positive, but they're both within a confidence interval that straddles 0, right? So no significant difference there. And estimates depending on how you run your estimates, they may be more or less volatile with a wider or narrower confidence interval as well. And I think we get into, I think I've got a graph on that as well. So is that just because there's too much variance going on? Is, you know, those kinds of things that maybe in the second one we didn't see it? Could be a lot of reasons, but basically no big change in conclusion, no significant difference there. The direction of the difference and the general magnitude of the difference in the two in emergency department primary care visits are pretty, you know, they're close. The estimates are a little different, but the broader takeaway in comparing these is still a similar story. And in dental visits, again, you saw this was one of the places where we saw a significant difference that was in this direction, where there's a significant difference in dental visits between a couple of different kinds of managed care programs. And that was a significant difference in a direction that was opposite what we saw in emergency department primary care visits. Again, I'm not worried about telling you which primary care, or sorry, which managed care organization we were comparing or anything, but the point is that, you know, by and large, the takeaway message is fairly similar, but we're doing it with a very different population or a very different analytic sample. Because in the second one, we have dropped a lot of people because of that 6-month continuous enrollment criterion. We've dropped a lot of people. And so it's just something to figure out, you know, what are we trying to represent? Was the censoring weight approach that bad? Was it okay? You know, these are the kinds of definitely hindsight being 2020 and how we would design our protocol differently and all kinds of other things that you learn. But actually the censoring weight approach and the, you know, continuous enrollment criterion approach ended up with at least similar conclusions, if not exactly the same estimates. Some other things that we've run into in this population. One is that, and I've mentioned this before, but the Medicare-derived algorithms that are really commonly used. So people have asked about this in the chat. If you're familiar with Medicare data, particularly fee-for-service, the master beneficiary summary file, that is the denominator file for Medicare, has a segment, has more than one segment on chronic conditions that have already been coded for you. In other words, they're just flags for that condition. If you trust those data, those are really useful flags. We looked at those algorithms as the basis for how we would, for one of the ways that we would look at risk adjustment in a few of our, and actually descriptive looks for chronic conditions and so on, in how we've looked at the Medicaid expansion population in Minnesota. And what we've found is that they are likely undersensitive. That is that so if I can kind of contextualize this, the way that we've discussed, and this is not just our statement, but the way that we found to discuss a number of the people in the expansion population, especially the early expansion population, which was very low income, is that the biological age in terms of chronic conditions and so on seems to be higher than people's chronological age. People age a little more quickly, at least as you look at them through identifying conditions and so on in this population than what you might expect. And so the rates that we were seeing didn't match up with some of the other data that we had seen from internal health system data and other things. So what we ended up doing was we allowed the algorithms to be more sensitive. So we took the basis of those algorithms, but instead of requiring, so one is to require more than one type of claim to be positive for a particular condition. We allowed just one in some cases. So we kind of retooled those algorithms, and that's one thing that we really had to do to identify things. Another thing, and this is something that would not be possible in the TAF data. You'd have to figure out a different way to do this. But homelessness was a major confounder and characterizing variable, particularly for one of the groups we were looking at. And there really wasn't a good way to assess that in enrollment data. There was a homelessness flag in the enrollment data that we were looking at, but it wasn't very good. And there are diagnostic codes for homelessness, and they're also pretty undersensitive and not very good. And so what we did was we had, again, since we had data that were provided by the state, we were able to do some validation work with some other data and develop an address-based flag for homelessness. We've got a paper in Health Services Research on that. Kate Vickery is the first author on that one. And then, like I said, we did do I think I put this in the chat yesterday, but we did a blog post kind of pulling together all this and just kind of trying to describe this population later on. But again, that homelessness issue, that would be something where it's a key variable, you know it's important potentially in your sample, and it would not be readily addressable the way that we did with those type of state provided Medicaid data. But I think it is a good kind of call for attention to creative use of the data to try to address some of these, what we know to be pretty major factors. You know, we're running out of time. This was just an example of when you're looking at Medicaid. Medicaid is a you know, we think of it as a monthly kind of enrollment, and so this is just an example where that we don't have to get into. I think for in the purposes of time, but we just, long story short, we used what are called marginal structural models that use inverse probability weights, but they're time varying inverse probability weights, and you end up with cool but noisy things like this. But then you have to think about what you're going to do about the noise that's created by some very large weights when you have a very volatilely enrolled and volatilely using population. A lot of high variability between months can result in these wide confidence intervals after the application of the weights. So it's just, these are some of the choices that you need to make. And that's, I think we've probably covered this enough, so I think we'll go to the end just in the purposes of time.